The fluorescent lights above Trauma Bay 3 hummed their nightly song, a sound like machinery grinding beneath the earth. Katie Rodriguez moved through Seattle General's emergency department at 0200 hours with the kind of invisible efficiency that made her forgettable, the type of nurse other staff members never quite remembered by name, only by function. Reliable. Quiet. Someone who never asked questions and never demanded credit. She had spent 3 years perfecting this version of herself, a civilian mask so convincing that her own reflection had started to believe it. She restocked the chest tube tray with methodical precision, each instrument positioned at exact angles, the way they had been positioned in a forward operating base outside Tikrit 9 years ago, in a life that officially no longer existed. Her hands moved through the motions without thinking, muscle memory older than her cover story. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. Silk sutures. Chest tube connector. Everything arranged for rapid access, for the kind of crisis that required speed and no hesitation. The newer nurses on night shift gossiped about their weekends near the break room coffee maker. Katie worked in silence, the way silence had kept her alive. She wore long sleeves despite Houston's oppressive heat, cotton that clung to her skin in the overheated ER. The sleeves concealed burn scars that mapped across her forearms like a geography of survival, white colloid tissue that told stories her voice was forbidden to speak. Above her collarbone, hidden beneath her scrubs, hung a single dog tag on a broken chain. The other tag was gone, buried in Arlington, and that absence was heavier than any metal. She had learned to carry both the weight and the silence. When Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrived for his 2100 shift, he moved through the ER like a man counting inventory in his own warehouse. Everything in Seattle General existed in relation to him, the hierarchy, the respect, the careful distant staff members maintained. He was the kind of doctor whose name appeared on hospital letterhead and whose recommendations could build or demolish careers. His eye scanned the nurse's station with a calculation of someone running equations only he could see. When those eyes landed on Katie restocking the code cart, he watched her for exactly 7 seconds, long enough to file away an observation, not long enough for her to notice. A capable nurse. Efficient. The kind who wouldn't challenge protocol or ask for credit. Exactly the kind of subordinate any department director appreciated. Katie felt his gaze the way prey animals sense distant movement, but she didn't pause. She had learned not to pause. Pausing was how they noticed you. Pausing was how they asked questions. She adjusted the tourniquet angles on the crash cart, each one positioned for immediate access, the way they taught you in a combat medic course that technically didn't appear on her official nursing credentials. Everything about her was a careful lie wrapped in competence. The night shift proceeded with its usual rhythm. A cardiac patient admitted for monitoring. A diabetic in hyperglycemic crisis. An elderly woman with pneumonia, coughing into tissue stained with rust-colored sputum. Katie moved between rooms like a ghost, checking vitals, adjusting medications, documenting everything in the EMR with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that precision was protection. Incomplete notes could be questioned. Incomplete notes could draw scrutiny. She had built 3 years of perfect documentation, a paper trail that proved she was exactly what she claimed to be, a trauma-certified night nurse with prior EMT experience and nothing remarkable to report. At 03 for 7 hours, the doors of the trauma bay burst open with the violence of emergency lights and paramedic voices. The sound was immediate and commanding, siren still wailing outside, radio static crackling with codes, boots striking tile in urgent rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. The percussion of crisis arriving. 68-year-old male, GSW complication from 1987, re-rupture of surgical site, coding in transit, 3 minutes out, the paramedic shouted, his voice carrying the specific cadence of someone trained to compress information into survival. Started compressions at scene, got sinus rhythm once, then dropped again at 03 for 4 hours. 2 rounds epi, 1 round atropine. Last BP 60/40 and dropping. Katie moved toward the trauma bay without waiting for instructions. Her body already knew what was needed, the same knowledge that had kept Marines alive on a Black Ops compound where her presence was officially classified as never having existed. Blood pressure 60/40 meant minutes, not hours. The patient's heart was failing the way exhausted organs fail when they've already survived things they shouldn't have. She understood that language intimately. The stretcher came through the doors with the force of velocity, and Katie saw him for the first time in 9 years. She didn't pause. She didn't recognize him aloud. The professional walls held firm, reinforced by 3 years of civilian practice, by military discipline so deep it had become breathing. But her hands knew. Her hands knew exactly what this man's presence meant. The elderly patient was massive, broad-chested, still carrying the physical presence of someone who had spent 40 years commanding respect through pure gravitational force. His chest was open, literally, the surgical site from an old GSW rupturing fresh with arterial bleeding that painted the stretcher sheets in arterial red. Chaos. Exactly the kind of controlled chaos where Katie had learned to think most clearly. Trauma Bay 2, she called, her voice cutting through the organized pandemonium. Get me 2 units ONEG uncrossed, 18-gauge access, code blue kit to the bedside, now. The authority in those 7 words was absolute, not a request, not a question. A command delivered in the specific tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. The younger nurses moved. One of them was already on the phone with the blood bank. Another had the crash cart wheeled to the adjacent wall. Katie positioned herself at the patient's left side, her hands already moving to assess the wound. Dr. Caldwell arrived in the doorway of Trauma Bay 2 at the precise moment Katie's hands made contact with the patient's chest. He watched what happened next with the careful attention of a man trying to understand something just outside his professional vocabulary. Her hands moved with surgical precision, not the careful, tentative movements of a nurse following physician protocol, but the fluid, automatic efficiency of someone who had done this before. Many times. Under fire. Without supervision or second-guessing or the luxury of hesitation. She assessed the wound in 3 seconds. Arterial rupture at the surgical site, bleeding from the right internal mammary. Bleeding that would kill him in 4 minutes if it wasn't contained. Katie's left hand found the hemorrhage point while her right reached for the supplies that had already been positioned. She had set them up correctly because some knowledge doesn't require civilian certification to be accurate. Type and cross, she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Full blood panel, lactate, CBC. 14-gauge access bilaterally. She was already cleaning the wound field, her movements economical and exact. Not wasting motion. Not wasting time. Every gesture was the tactical efficiency of trauma medicine performed in an environment where the next era meant body bags and memorial ceremonies. Get me warm saline, full unit rapid infuser, and start 2 wide-bore 4s. Now, not when you feel like it. The room organized around her instructions. Not because she was the physician, she wasn't. Not because she held any official authority over trauma decisions, she didn't, technically. But because her hands moved the way only people who had seen real trauma and survived it moved. Because her voice carried the weight of someone who had held dying Marines together with nothing but pressure and will and refusal to accept defeat. Caldwell watched from the doorway. His eyes narrowed slightly, cataloging details his medical degree told him should be present but hadn't appeared. The way she palpated for the arterial rupture, that was intermediate-level anatomy. The way she anticipated the hemostatic challenge before it fully manifested, that was experience-level thinking. The way she orchestrated the room's response without raising her voice, that was leadership at a level that didn't appear on night shift nursing credentials. He noted it. Filed it away. Made a mental note to review her personnel file when he had access to his office computer. Katie had the hemorrhage controlled by 03:51 hours, less than 4 minutes from door to containment. The patient's heart responded to medication, sinus rhythm establishing at 89 beats per minute, strong enough to maintain perfusion. The trauma surgeon arrived at 03:57 hours and found the patient stabilized to the point where emergency thoracotomy was no longer an immediate necessity. He gave Katie a look that lasted exactly 2 seconds, a glance that carried some question his professional experience recognized but his conscious mind couldn't quite articulate, and then moved into standard surgical protocol. Good work, Rodriguez, the surgeon said, stripping off his initial exam gloves. Patient stable. Heading to OR in 5. She nodded and began the transition protocols, documenting everything in precise medical language, her penmanship perfect, her notes comprehensive. Blood products administered. Vital signs trended. Patient response to interventions. By 04:13 hours, the patient had been transferred to surgical care, and Katie had returned to her duties like someone who had never broken character, who had never revealed anything except professional competence at the highest level of her actual credentials. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Caldwell had been watching the entire time, and in the 15 minutes he'd observed Katie Rodriguez orchestrate a trauma save with the precision of someone trained in military medicine, something had shifted in his calculation of who she was and what she represented. She had become a question he needed answered. She had become a threat to the carefully maintained ecosystem of his authority. And men like Marcus Caldwell solved questions and threats the way they had always solved them, by making them disappear. The stretcher wheeled through the automatic doors at 11:02 p.m., and Katie Rodriguez's world stopped breathing. The patient was elderly, grey-faced, his chest wrapped in surgical gauze that was already bleeding through. VA complications, the paramedic said, wound dehiscence from a procedure 3 weeks prior, now septic, now crashing. The code team assembled in Trauma Bay 4 with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times. Katie moved toward the crash cart, her hands already reaching for the defibrillator pads, when she looked at the patient's face. Colonel James Vance. 22 years older than the last time she'd seen him, but unmistakable. The same sharp jaw. The same eyes, now rolling back as his oxygen saturation plummeted. The man who presided over her court-martial. The man who'd signed the order erasing her from the Marine Corps. Her vision tunneled. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, she couldn't move. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, and the rest of the world seemed to compress into a single point of pressure behind her sternum. Muscle memory fought against paralysis. Training won. She didn't flinch. She steadied her breathing and moved. Size 14 angiocath. Now, she said, her voice dropping 2 registers without permission. A resident hesitated. Katie was already positioning Vance's arm, finding the vein with the certainty of someone who'd done this in a tent in Tikrit under mortar fire. The needle went in. Blood backed into the fall line. Good, good, good. Push 1 of epi. A nurse stared at her. I said now. The medication went in. Vance's monitor showed a chaotic rhythm that looked like it wanted to be sinus but couldn't quite remember how. Katie positioned the defibrillator pads with the kind of precision that comes from having saved lives in a situation where hesitation meant body bags. 200 joules. Charge. Clear. The electrical current snapped through his chest, and his body arced. The monitor changed. Sinus rhythm bloomed across the screen like a flower opening in fast motion. A legitimate, salvageable heartbeat. Pulse check, Katie said. No one moved. Pulse. Check. A resident fumbled for the carotid artery and nodded. We have a pulse. Katie stepped back from the stretcher, and that's when she saw her. A woman in dress blue standing in the doorway. A Marine captain's insignia. Vance's daughter, judging by the architectural similarity of her face, her cheekbones sharp as a drill sergeant's tone. The captain's eyes had tracked every move Katie made during the resuscitation, and they held the specific intensity of someone who recognized precision when she saw it. The crash team scattered into their assigned roles, 1 doctor coordinating the ICU admission, 2 nurses establishing a second line, someone calling the surgical floor. Katie moved toward the supply cabinet to restock, her jaw clenched so hard she thought her molars might fracture. She had survived 3 years of invisibility. 3 years of night shifts and careful anonymity. 3 years of being nobody, which was what the Marine Corps had ordered her to be. Nobody nurses didn't draw attention. Nobody nurses didn't have shadows that extended back to classified operations and court-martials and a black site in Tikrit that had gone sideways in ways the Pentagon would spend decades burying. She had been safe as long as she remained invisible. The door to Vance's room swung open before she could process the next breath. Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood in the doorway, his silk tie still perfectly knotted at 11:52 p.m., which meant he'd been at the hospital for one of his charity observation rounds. His eyes were narrowed, calculating, the way a chess player's eyes narrow when an opponent makes a move that doesn't match the expected game. He watched her for 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Then he smiled a smile that looked like a shark showing its teeth. "Nurse Rodriguez," he said, his voice coating the name in condescension like syrup over glass. "Quite the performance. Perhaps we should discuss what a nursing scope of practice means in the context of your employment." Katie didn't answer. She was restocking supplies, replacing the angiocath needles, straightening the crash cart, moving through the ritual of restoration with the kind of mechanical precision that kept her hands from shaking. One measured breath. Then another. Caldwell followed her into Vance's room, where the captain stood beside her father's bed, watching monitors climb and stabilize. O2 saturation, 94. Heart rate, 102. Blood pressure, 118/74. Survivable numbers. Vance's eyes were still closed, but his breathing was steady, his chest rising and falling without the wet rasp of acute distress. "Colonel Vance," Caldwell said, his voice adjusting to the tone he used for authority figures, respectful, careful, the voice of a man who understood hierarchies. "You're stable. You're going to be fine. We have excellent surgeons standing by, and your care is my personal priority." Vance didn't respond. Sedation was already flowing through his foreline, necessary for the intubation that was surely coming, for the procedures his wound would demand. Caldwell turned to the captain, and his expression shifted again, becoming the concerned physician, the healer, the man who'd built his reputation on caring. "Your father was incredibly fortunate that we caught this when we did. Most hospitals wouldn't have diagnosed the dehiscence this quickly." He paused. "Let the implication hang. Most hospitals and most nurses. He should make a full recovery. You can feel confident in his care." The captain's eyes moved from Caldwell to Katie, who was checking the monitor leads and saying nothing. "My father coded," the captain said. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something that recognized what Katie had done in those first 40 seconds. "What I observed was immediate identification of septic shock, rapid for access, appropriate medication sequencing, and textbook defibrillation. That's not fortunate." The captain looked directly at Caldwell. "That's competent." Caldwell's smile thinned. "Nursing protocols are designed for safety. Deviating from those protocols, even with the best intentions, can create liability and patient risk. I'm sure Nurse Rodriguez understands that as well as anyone." "Needle decompression," Katie said quietly. The first word she'd spoken directly to Caldwell in the 3 minutes since he'd entered the room. "That's a procedure." "Advanced airway management." "That's also a procedure. Your patient was in septic shock with a tension pneumothorax secondary to wound failure. The protocols require physician authorization." She met his eyes. "Not a challenge. A statement of fact. But your patient was going into cardiac arrest. So I made a call." "A call," Caldwell repeated, his voice turning sharp as a scalpel. "You made a call that is explicitly outside your licensure, in front of witnesses, that created documented evidence of scope creep that any plaintiff's attorney would use to build a malpractice case against this hospital." He stepped closer. "Do you understand the position you've put us in, Rodriguez? Or did your correspondence school forget to mention that the word a nurse means you follow protocols, not create them?" One tear escaped from Katie's left eye. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Caldwell, and when she spoke, her voice was level as a laser. "I've had worse commanders, Doctor. At least you're not sending anyone into an actual minefield." The room went dead silent. The captain inhaled sharply. Caldwell's face flushed the color of raw beef, and for a moment he looked like a man who'd been physically struck. Katie turned back to the monitor, checking vital signs, adjusting for flow rates, moving through the mechanical details of post-resuscitation care as if she hadn't just referenced classified combat operations to a man who could destroy her. Caldwell stood frozen in the doorway. His eyes were narrowing again, not calculating this time, processing. Cataloging. The smile that had been thin was now gone entirely. "I expect a full written incident report by 0800 tomorrow," he said finally. "Detail every step you took and your reasoning for each deviation from protocol." "And Rodriguez?" He waited until she looked at him. "Stay in your lane." He left. The captain remained. For almost a minute, neither woman spoke. The ventilator hissed its rhythmic song. The monitors beat their steady electronic pulse. Outside the window, Houston at midnight was a grid of sodium vapor lights stretching toward infinity. "You were in the field," the captain said. "Not a question. An observation. The way you moved. The way you called codes. That wasn't civilian training." Katie didn't answer. She couldn't. The regulations were explicit: any admission of prior military service would trigger federal investigation, potential prosecution, the unraveling of the careful fiction the Marine Corps had constructed around her disappearance. Saying nothing was the only safe answer. "My name is Sarah," the captain said. "Sarah Vance. My father mentioned you once. Years ago. He said there was a major he'd underestimated, and it cost him in ways he'd never fully explain. He said it was the biggest mistake of his career." The captain paused. "He said her name was Katie." Katie's hands stopped moving. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Then she forced air into her lungs, forced her hands to resume their work, forced her voice to remain level. "I hope your father recovers," Katie said. "His prognosis is excellent." The next morning, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the break room. The paper was laminated, official, printed on hospital letterhead. Incident report, unauthorized advanced procedures. RN Rodriguez performed needle decompression without physician authorization. Patient outcome was positive, however scope of practice violation created liability exposure and safety concern. Mandatory remedial nursing training required. Quality improvement pathway to be established. Katie read it once. Didn't flinch. Didn't crumple the paper or argue. Just read it and walked away. But when she sat down in the break room at 14:38 that afternoon with her untouched turkey sandwich and black coffee, 5 nurses gathered their lunches in pointed silence. Gathered them without looking at her, without speaking, and relocated to the hallway outside. One of them, a day shift RN named Morrison, muttered something about cowboy nurses loud enough to carry. Katie stared at her coffee. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The chain was broken, had been broken since the day they'd told her to disappear, since they'd informed her that her husband had died in the same theater, in the same week, and that she wouldn't be allowed to mourn him in uniform. She'd kept the tag anyway. Worn it under her clothes for 3 years. The physical proof that Major Catherine Rodriguez had existed, had mattered, had loved a man who died for the same country that had ordered her to vanish. Dr. Caldwell entered the break room at 14:23. He saw her sitting alone. Saw the isolation around her like a force field. He smiled. "I hope you're reflecting on team dynamics, Rodriguez," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Pride really does come before a fall. Your colleagues are starting to question your judgment. The board will be reviewing your file. And honestly," he leaned against the counter with the easy confidence of a man who'd already won, "I'm not sure there's any coming back from this one." Katie didn't look up from her coffee. She heard his footsteps leave, heard the door close, heard the fluorescent lights continue their endless humming overhead. She was still invisible. Still nobody. Still erased. But she wasn't dead. And that dog tag, burning against her chest like a coal, meant something. It meant she'd been real once. It meant someone had loved her. It meant that staying invisible had a limit, and she was approaching it fast. The isolation started small. On Monday, Katie arrived for her evening shift to find her name removed from the trauma rotation schedule. The assignment board, posted outside the break room where every nurse could see it, listed her for administrative support, data entry, chart review. No explanation. No conversation. No warning. Just a reassignment that stripped her of the work that kept her alive. Dr. Caldwell was nowhere near the unit when she discovered it. That was intentional. He was learning. By Tuesday, a new policy memo appeared in every staff mailbox. Single-spaced. Dated that morning. It read, effective immediately, all nursing assessments beyond standard vital signs, respiratory assessment, cardiovascular evaluation, wound inspection, neurological screening, require physician pre-approval before implementation. This is a temporary measure to ensure protocol consistency and patient safety. The memo was signed by Caldwell, copied to the hospital administrator, the nursing director, and the quality assurance department. 15 nurses read it. 11 glanced at Katie. None of them said anything. The effect was surgical. Katie could take blood pressure, pulse, temperature, respiratory rate. She could document. She could observe. She could do nothing. On Wednesday, her access badge stopped working on the ICU doors. She tried at 6:33 p.m., between chart entries, and the reader beeped red. Denied. The security guard who came to help her, a kid named Torres, 23, always polite, looked uncomfortable. Says here you're restricted to administrative areas, he said, reading from his tablet. Pending safety review. It's posted. I'm sorry. It was posted. On the unit bulletin board, beside the staff birthday calendar and the new hand-washing protocol, was a bright yellow notice printed on hospital letterhead. Temporary access restriction, nursing staff. Katie's full name. For purposes of staff retraining and protocol recalibration. Not termination. Not an investigation. Not an accusation. Just a soft, bureaucratic knife that removed her access to every patient, every clinical area, every place where she mattered. That was when the break room became a graveyard. The nurses she'd worked alongside for 3 years, Sarah, who'd complained about her shift schedule for months, Marcus, who'd borrowed her stethoscope more times than he'd returned it, Jennifer, who'd covered Katie's overtime last Christmas, stopped sitting with her. Not dramatically. Not with confrontation. They simply gathered their lunches when Katie entered, exchanged glances, and moved to the hallway or the outer office or anywhere else. Jennifer was the first to leave. Sarah followed. Then Marcus. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Caldwell had made it clear, through policy and restriction and public notice, that proximity to Katie Rodriguez was a risk they shouldn't take. By Thursday morning, Katie sat alone in the break room at 7:15 a.m., eating eggs that had gone cold an hour ago, listening to the fluorescent light above her head emit a low electrical hum. 3 years. 3 years of night shifts, of staying invisible, of keeping her head down and her hands steady. 3 years of being good enough, quiet enough, unremarkable enough to stay erased. She'd failed at invisibility the moment Vance coded. The shift on Friday, 3 days into the isolation, started like every other night. Katie completed her data entry work, chart audits, mostly, looking for documentation gaps that didn't exist, and sat at the administrative station, watching the unit through glass walls like a visitor at a zoo. The ICU held 18 beds. 15 were occupied. Colonel Vance occupied room 402, 3 doors down from where Katie couldn't be. At 11:43 p.m., the monitors started singing. The alarm came first, a sharp, rising beep from Vance's room. Then the nurse call button, repeatedly, his daughter's voice cracking through the speaker, "We need help. Now. Something's wrong." Katie's head came up. She was on her feet before thought caught up with her. The ICU nurse assigned to Vance was Linda, competent but careful, the type who followed protocol exactly and called doctors for anything that fell outside the lines. Linda was already moving, but Katie could see from the hallway that she was checking vitals, questioning what she was seeing on the monitor. Vance's oxygen saturation dropping. His blood pressure sliding sideways. His heart rate climbing. The wound dressing on his left chest was darkening. Not just dark. Saturated. Blood pooling beneath the sheets. Pneumothorax. Hemothorax. Surgical complication. The chest cavity filling with blood, the pressure mounting, the heart and lungs compressed like a fist closing. Katie moved. She didn't think about access badges or policy memos or Caldwell's yellow notice. She moved like a Marine moving under fire, direct, efficient, without hesitation. The ICU door was controlled from the nursing station. She'd have to ask Linda to buzz her through, would have to explain why an administrative nurse needed entry, would lose seconds to conversation. Instead, she went to the patient entrance, the automatic doors, the ones that opened for anyone with a body to pass through. The alarm was louder on the inside. Vance's room was 3 down. She ran. His chest was heaving. The dressing was soaked through, blood dark against the white gauze, dripping onto the sheets. His daughter, Captain Sarah Vance, Marine dress uniform even at midnight, still wearing her ribbons from her own deployments, was standing against the wall, watching her father drown in blood, watching his face go grey. Linda was holding pressure with a fresh dressing, but her movements were too slow, too uncertain. How long? Katie's voice was a command, not a question. Linda looked up. 3 minutes. I called. The team is coming, but... How long until the attending? 7, maybe 8. 7 minutes. Vance's pressure was 78/44. His saturation was 71 and falling. The sutures holding his surgical repair had given way, probably the left lower lobe artery, the kind of bleeding that was silent until it wasn't, the kind that filled the space around the lungs and collapsed the whole system. Katie could see it in the way his face had gone slack, in the way his right side was moving differently from his left, in the way he wasn't fighting anymore. She reached for the phone at the bedside. She pressed the code button. The operator came on immediately. Code blue, ICU room for O2. The overhead came alive, code blue, ICU for O2. Code blue, ICU for O2. Vance's daughter moved. Not away. Closer. She saw something in Katie's face that made her step near instead of stepping back. Maybe she recognized what 3 tours looked like. Maybe she knew what a major's hands looked like. Maybe she was a Marine who knew the difference between protocol and survival. Get me a tray with sterile drapes, Katie said. 18-gauge needle, for setup. And grab that crash cart, push it closer. She didn't ask Linda. She told her. The voice had changed. The softness was gone. The 3 years of deferential apologies had evaporated. Linda hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she moved. Katie's hands went to work. Muscle memory took over. Not the hospital version of her. The other version. The one who'd learned this in the dark, in the dust, with mortar rounds walking across the compound and a Marine whose name she couldn't remember because memorizing names meant feeling it when they stopped breathing. She exposed the wound site, saw the source immediately, the suture line spreading, old blood and new blood, the pressure inside the chest cavity mounting by the second. She grabbed the needle. 16 gauge. In Tikrit, she'd used what was available. Here, she had equipment. The pleasure of equipment. She positioned it at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomy exact, the angle precise. She pushed through skin and fascia until she felt the give, the sudden release of pressure as air and blood hissed out through the needle. The sound was wrong. It wasn't air. It was blood. Fluid. Hemothorax. She pulled the needle. Kept the catheter. Linda. Fluid kit. Level 1 rapid infuser. Now. Linda was already moving. The code team was 90 seconds out, maybe less. She could hear their feet on the stairs, the rapid percussion of running boots, the sound of equipment carts being pushed hard. That's when the phone rang. Not from the code team. From above. From Caldwell's home line, patched through to the unit, his voice crackling across the speaker like a transmission from a bunker. "I'm hearing code blue, room for O2. Katie, step back." That is a direct order. Katie didn't look up. She was prepping the infusion site, positioning the large-bore catheter, calculating volumes. Vance's pressure was already climbing. 84/48. His saturation inching up. The hemorrhage wasn't contained yet, the surgical repair was compromised, but buying time was the only game that mattered. "Katie. Did you hear me? You are not authorized for emergency procedures. Step back immediately." "His pleural space is full," Katie said. The voice that came out wasn't the administrative nurse's voice. It wasn't deferential. It was a commander reporting facts to a superior officer who didn't understand the battlefield. "Hemothorax from surgical site rupture. I've decompressed the immediate pressure. He needs transfusion and the OR. I don't care what you've diagnosed. That is not your assessment to make. You are a nurse. Step back from that patient." That is a direct order. Katie was already pushing the first unit of blood. The infuser hummed. The pressure in the bag forcing fluids into Vance's vein. His BP climbing. 92/52. 98/54. The code team burst through the door, 5 people in scrubs and rushing energy, the attending physician in front, the surgical resident behind him. They took one look at the room, at Vance stabilizing, at the controlled hemorrhage, at the four-setup already running, at Katie's hand steady as surgical steel, and the attending stopped moving. "Report," he said. Not to Linda. To Katie. "Hemothorax from surgical site rupture. I decompressed atmospheric pressure approximately 2 minutes ago. He's on 2 large bore 4s, 1 unit PRBCs running, 2nd unit ready to push. BP responding. O2 climbing. He needs the OR. Now." The attending looked at the monitors. Looked at Vance. Looked at Katie. Something crossed his face. Recognition. Not of who she was, but of what she was. Someone who'd done this before. Someone who'd done it under conditions he couldn't imagine. Get him moving to the OR. Blood bank, full cross-match, type and screen, and get surgery on the phone. Now. The room became chaos in the efficient, practiced way of surgical teams. They were already moving. Vance was already being prepped for transport. The crash cart was already rolling. The code team was already calling ahead. Katie stepped back. Her hands were covered in blood. The dressing she'd used to wipe her fingers came from the supply tray. Red on white. She was still standing there, motionless, when Caldwell's voice came through the phone again. "Katie. You are relieved from duty. Effective immediately. Step away from the unit. You are not to participate in any further codes or patient care. I'm calling the nursing director. You will wait in the administrative office for security escort. That is not a request. That is a command." The line went dead. The phone hung in the silence like a guillotine between heartbeats. Captain Vance was still in the room. She was staring at Katie the way Marines stare when they recognize something they've been trained to recognize. A rank. A call sign. A shadow that shouldn't exist in civilian life. "Thank you," she said. "For my father." Katie nodded. She couldn't speak yet. Not until the shaking stopped. And the shaking wouldn't stop until she was alone. So she turned and walked toward the break room, where nobody would follow her, where she could sit in the fluorescent light and watch the blood dry on her hands and understand, finally, that staying invisible had an expiration date, and she'd just let it expire in front of witnesses. Colonel Vance's monitor screamed. 3 short beeps, then flat line. The sound like a siren reversing direction, pulling all the air out of the room at once. Katie was moving before Dr. Caldwell's voice even registered. The chest wound had reopened, the sutures from surgical repair giving way under pressure, bleeding into the mediastinal cavity. She could see it in the oxygen saturation numbers plummeting on the monitor, 82. 78. 71. The patient was drowning in his own blood. "Step back," Caldwell said from the doorway, his voice clinical and certain. "I'm calling a rapid response." Katie didn't hear him. Her hands were already reaching for the nearest meal tray, a dinner he hadn't touched, plastic packaging still sealed. She tore it open with her teeth. The sound of ripping plastic cut through the monitor alarm like a scalpel through skin. Her hands moved with the terrifying precision of someone who'd done this before, on dark FOB nights when there was no surgical team, just a wound and a choice. She grabbed the cardboard backing from the tray, peeled away the plastic film, pressed it down over the reopened wound with one gloved hand while her other hand found the call button with the exact pressure needed, loud enough to summon the code team, not loud enough to indicate panic. 02 sat, 65. 62, 58. "Stop." Caldwell's voice was sharper now, moving into the room. "You don't have orders to intervene." Katie's hands didn't pause. She used one piece of medical tape from the crash cart, peeled it with a single motion that spoke of 10,000 training repetitions, and sealed the plastic covering the wound. The technique was called an improvised chest seal, and she'd done it exactly like this in Tikrit in 2016 when a Marine took shrapnel through the anterior chest and the nearest surgical facility was 40 minutes away by helicopter. "Keep the blood in. Keep the air out. Buy time." "I said stand down, Rodriguez." Caldwell's face was reddening now, but it wasn't rage. It was fear. He was frozen in the doorway, watching her move like she was operating some kind of equipment he didn't recognize. The second nurse arrived, Martinez, young, smart, panicked. Katie's voice dropped an octave. "Manual pressure on the seal. 70 pounds. Count with me." "What?" Martinez stared. "Now." Martinez's hands moved. Katie reached for the sterile gloves hanging from the crash cart and pulled a size 18-gauge angiocath needle from the rapid sequence drawer. If there was air trapped in the chest cavity, if the pressure was building against the collapsed lung, the plastic seal would buy time, but only time. She'd seen this wound pattern before. Knew what happened next. "You are practicing medicine without a license," Caldwell said flatly, his voice like someone reading from a script he'd prepared in advance. "This is beyond your scope." Katie found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the landmark as familiar as her own pulse. She inserted the needle. The sound came, the hiss of pressurized air escaping, like a tire decompressing, like a soldier's last breath. She heard Martinez gasp. "Keep pressure," Katie said. The monitor began to climb. 68, 74. 81, 88. Sinus rhythm. The numbers climbing like a ladder she could actually see. 3 more nurses crowded into the room now, drawn by the chaos and the codes. All of them watching. All of them seeing her hands move with the precision of someone who'd learned this trade under fire, not under fluorescent lights. Dr. Caldwell stood at the threshold, his mouth slightly open, and Katie understood in that moment what she'd done. She'd shown her real hands. The hands of a major, not a night shift nurse. The hands of someone who'd held soldiers together in places where field hospitals existed in shipping containers and triage meant deciding who lived because there wasn't time to save everyone. The code was called. The surgical team responded. Colonel Vance was stable enough to move. The plastic seal held. The needle had done its job. By every clinical measure, the patient was alive because of an unauthorized procedure performed by someone who had no legal authority to perform it. Dr. Caldwell watched it all with the look of a man watching a threat he couldn't yet identify but absolutely needed to eliminate. 22 minutes later, Katie was still in the ICU when she heard his voice in the hallway. Even before she saw him, she recognized the timbre he'd left in civilian clothes at 0330, furious, but now he'd returned in his white coat like armor. His face was composed, but his hands were moving too fast as he walked. "Your badge," he said to Katie, cutting through the morning shift report. She removed it without speaking and handed it over. "You're removed from clinical duties, effective immediately." His voice was parade ground level, loud enough for every nurse in the station to hear. "You performed unauthorized medical procedures on a sedated patient without physician orders. You directly violated my instructions. That constitutes scope violation and patient endangerment." A nurse checking medications looked away. Another pretended to be very focused on her charting. "We'll complete this discussion in my office," Caldwell said. The security escort was waiting by the time they reached the hallway junction. Katie recognized him, Wilson, who worked nights, who had 2 kids in Catholic school and always left early to pick them up on Thursdays. He looked embarrassed as he fell into step beside her, maintaining distance like protocol dictated. The locker room was empty at this hour. Caldwell had scheduled it that way. She understood his methods now. No witnesses until the witnesses mattered. She cleaned out her locker in silence, the extra scrub she kept folded on the top shelf, the deodorant, the protein bars she'd brought from home. Nothing else. There was nothing else to remove. The dog tag on the broken chain stayed around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of her street clothes. "By Monday, you'll be reported to the state licensing board," Caldwell said, watching her. His phone was already in his hand, screen glowing. "I have calls into the board chair and our legal department. The narrative is straightforward. You exceeded your authority, performed invasive procedures without physician oversight, and created patient risk through reckless improvisation. That's not heroic. That's dangerous." Katie closed the locker door and turned to face him. Her voice when she spoke was perfectly level. "I've had worse commanders, Doctor." A pause. "At least you're not sending anyone into an actual minefield." Something flickered across his face, confusion, uncertainty, a split-second sense that she'd said something with weight he didn't understand. Then it was gone, replaced by bureaucratic certainty. "You're done here," he said. The rain started as Katie drove to Memorial Garden Cemetery. She'd known it would. Tikrit had taught her to read weather in the pressure of the air, the way the light changed before a storm. The clouds had been promising this since midnight. Now they were delivering rain that fell like punishment, hitting the windshield with the force of accusations. She knew exactly where Captain David Rodriguez was buried. Plot for 47, West Section, beneath a marble headstone with his rank, his name, the dates of his birth and death. Marine pilot. 7 years ago. He'd been killed during a classified operation that she'd never been cleared to know the details of, had been buried with full military honors that she'd been forbidden to attend because by then Major Katie Rodriguez didn't exist anymore. By then she was just a night shift nurse in Houston with an invented past and 3 years of careful invisibility. The mud at his grave was soft from the rain. Katie knelt, not caring about the wet seeping through her jeans, and placed her hand on the headstone. Cold. Smooth. Indifferent. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. Like I promised you. Keep your head down," they said. "Disappear. Don't surface. Don't let anyone see what you really are." The rain was harder now, running down her face, indistinguishable from tears. "I buried Major Rodriguez with you, and I kept the promise. For 3 years I kept it. But tonight I saw Colonel Vance coding and I couldn't let him die, and now I've failed us both. They're going to investigate. They're going to ask questions. The whole house of cards is falling apart." She reached beneath her collar and felt the dog tag, the single metal rectangle on a chain so old the silver had worn through to the brass beneath. David's name. His service number. The blood type they'd both shared. She brought it to her lips and held it there, the metal cold against her mouth. "I'm so sorry," she said to the grave, to the rain, to the marine pilot buried 3 feet beneath the mud. I'm so sorry. The sun was rising over Houston, gray and distant and indifferent, when Katie drove away from the cemetery. She had until Monday. The board chair would be called. The licensing investigation would begin. Dr. Caldwell had already set the narrative: reckless, dangerous, operating beyond her authority. She was a problem that institutional power would solve with paperwork and professional destruction. She had no idea that as she sat in her car in the cemetery parking lot, still soaked with rain, still wearing scrubs stained with Colonel Vance's blood, the colonel himself was regaining consciousness in a private room at Seattle General, his daughter standing vigil in dress uniform, and the first word out of the old Marine's mouth would crack open the careful architecture of her disappearance like a single stone breaking through glass. "Reaper," he would rasp into the dawn. And everything would change. The security escort shoes clicked against the tile like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Katie Rodriguez moved through the back hallways of Seattle General before dawn broke, her personal locker waiting like a coffin she had to open herself. 3 years of invisibility folded into a cardboard box. Her stethoscope. 2 spare pairs of compression socks. A paperback medical journal she'd never finished. The escort waited outside the locker room, arms crossed, pretending not to watch her hands shake as she turned the combination dial. 73 times. That's how many shifts she'd worked at this hospital without anyone knowing what she was capable of. 73 times she'd listened to the fluorescent lights buzz overhead and told herself that invisibility was survival. That staying erased meant staying safe. That if she kept her head down, kept her hand steady, kept her voice soft, the past would never catch up to her. The locker door swung open. She was halfway to the exit when she heard it. A single word. Raspy. Urgent. Unmistakable. Reaper. Katie stopped. The word hung in the hallway air like a detonation she couldn't unhear. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. Colonel Vance's voice, rough and broken from intubation, carried the weight of 7 years of buried history. That call sign. That word. Only 3 people in the world had known that name for her in Tikrit. 2 of them were dead. One of them was supposed to stay asleep in an ICU bed with a healing chest and a second chance at life. Reaper. He said it again, louder, the machines around him responding to his elevated heart rate. Katie turned. Slow. Measured. Her eyes met his across the distance of the hallway, and in that single moment, the careful construction of civilian Katie Rodriguez began to fracture. She saw recognition in his face. Not suspicion. Recognition. A door opened. Captain David Vance stepped into the hallway in dress uniform, her father's eyes, her father's bearing. She was 28 years old with the rank of captain in the United States Marine Corps, and apparently she'd been waiting for this moment since the night she arrived. Her gaze locked onto Katie's, and then she said 3 words that detonated everything. Major Rodriguez. The civilian name dissolved. Katie didn't respond. Couldn't. The captain was already moving, already reaching for Katie's arm with the gentle firmness of someone trained to handle trauma casualties. Come with me. Now. They walked in silence. Down another corridor. Into an administrator's office where the hospital's chief of staff sat behind a mahogany desk looking like someone who'd been asked to defuse a bomb without instructions. He stood when they entered. He looked at Captain Vance. Then back to Katie. His lips moved but nothing came out. A nurse appeared in the doorway, pulling Katie's file from the hospital system. Her name was Patricia. She'd worked the day shift for 4 years and had never said more than hello to Katie. Her hand trembled as she scanned the document on her screen. Her face went the color of fresh gauze. She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. DoD flag notation. Security clearance. Witness protection designation. Status, active. Flag issued 7 years prior. Cross-reference military personnel database. Cross-reference federal prisoner testimony. Oh my God. The door opened again. The hospital administrator entered with a man in civilian clothes who moved like gravity bent around him. Master Chief Marcus Webb. Former Navy SEAL. His beard was grey at the edges. His shoulders had the quality of someone who'd carried things the world wasn't meant to understand. He pulled up a chair and sat directly across from Katie like they were old friends about to have coffee. Bronze Star with Valor. His voice was quiet. Precise. Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. Joint Service Commendation Medal. Meritorious Service Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. And a Navy Cross. Navy Cross, Major. That's not a decoration. That's a statement. Each medal landed like artillery fire. Each one correct. Each one a piece of her that she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it didn't exist. The room seemed to compress. The air tasted like copper and burnt electronics. Patricia gripped the edge of the desk like it was the only solid thing left in the universe. Major Rodriguez provided testimony in 2019 that directly resulted in the conviction of 4 military officers and the exposure of a prison abuse network operating out of a black site detention facility, Webb continued. His eyes never left hers. That testimony put her name on a federal witness protection list. That testimony made her a threat to people who'd kill to keep that facility running. That testimony is why she's been living as a civilian nurse for 7 years. That testimony is why no one was supposed to know who she is. Katie's hands were steady. She'd been trained to absorb information under fire. This was no different. The captain stood beside her, protective, ready, still wearing her dress uniform like armor. The administrator was trying to look anywhere but at Katie's face. "When did you realize?" Katie asked. Her voice had changed. The softness was gone. Command had leaked through like radiation. "When she called you Major?" "Just now," Webb said, and there was respect in his eyes. "But Colonel Vance has been awake for 3 hours. He figured it out when he saw your hands." 3 doors down, Dr. Caldwell sat alone in his office with the lights off and the blinds drawn. His hands shook as he pulled up the security server. He knew what he'd done. He knew exactly what he'd done. The footage from the ICU. The footage of the codes. The footage of Katie performing medical interventions that should not have existed in her skill set. The footage of him standing in the doorway, frozen, useless, while a night shift nurse moved with the precision of someone who'd trained under combat conditions. If that footage got out, if the board saw what he'd actually done, if they learned what he'd actually failed to do. His fingers hovered over the delete button. Just delete. Server reset. Archive corruption. It was a small thing, technically speaking. 1 administrator with access credentials. 1 afternoon of problem solving. 1 absence of evidence. His career could survive almost anything except the truth. He didn't see Marcus Webb standing in his doorway until the IT director had already forwarded every frame to 3 different federal agencies and the state medical board. Webb's face was immobile. The face of someone who'd been trained to do difficult things without feeling them. He pulled up his monitor on Caldwell's desk screen. Every deletion logged. Every backup confirmed. Every timestamp and chain of custody documented with the precision of someone who'd worked in evidence rooms under fire. Federal witness tampering, Webb said quietly. Obstruction of justice. Evidence destruction. You're 3 doors down from FBI agent Morris. You want to walk or you want me to call her? Caldwell's phone began to ring. The board chair. His attorney. The nursing director. He didn't answer any of them. He stood, and he walked, and everything he'd built evaporated behind him like morning mist. Back in the administrator's office, Katie was already moving toward the door. The captain moved with her. Webb stood. Patricia was still holding the file like it might explode. Katie stopped in the doorway and looked at the chief of staff. "I'm sure you have paperwork," Katie said. "I'll sign whatever you need to sign." "There's actually a position," the administrator said, finding his voice. The military specifically requested they want a civilian trauma consultant. Training military combat medics. They asked for you specifically. By name. We didn't know it was possible to request someone by name when we thought you were just a night shift nurse, but apparently the Pentagon has very specific requirements. Katie didn't respond. She walked out of the office with the captain beside her, past the nurse's station where the entire day's shift had gone absolutely still, past the ICU where Colonel Vance lay with his eyes open, watching, waiting for the woman he'd ordered erased to finally walk back into the light. She accepted the position because staying in the shadows had never been a choice. It had always been a sentence. A sentence she'd served. A sentence that was finally, after 7 years of careful breathing and measured steps and hands that never trembled in public, finally over. The sun was rising over Houston. Katie Rodriguez walked out into it in civilian clothes carrying a cardboard box of her old life, no longer hiding, no longer running, no longer erased. The dog tag on the broken chain was still around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt, still touching her heart like a promise she'd finally kept. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and share this story. Comment below, would you have survived what Katie survived? And like if you believe the quiet ones are often the ones holding it all together.